The following transmission is a conversation with Jonah Lobe, former Bethesda creature artist responsible for creating nightmarish abominations like the Mirelurks, Bloodbugs, and the Fallout 4 Deathclaw. By his own words, the best monster he's ever created. For those who venture far enough down the Bethesda rabbit hole, they will eventually run into Jonah. Having spent 7 years working on creature design for Fallout 3, Skyrim, and Fallout 4, Jonah has helped to bring to life some of the most visually stunning creatures in all of video games. Since his departure, he has worked on multiple different projects, with his current passion being the story of a mute skeleton named Quiet, the main character of his new graphic novel, Quiet Level 1. Over the course of our conversation, we discussed Jonah's time creating for Bethesda, other artistic journeys he has taken both before and since, as well as the current story of Quiet and his adventures. I am follower Toshi, and this is the Atomcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow for future episodes, and consider subscribing to our Patreon, where your monthly contributions will go towards improving the quality of transmissions, keeping episodes ad-free, as well as helping to decrease the time between uploads. As always, links to our Patreon, as well as guest socials, can be found in the description. And be sure to leave a comment recommending creators that you'd like to see in future episodes. Without further ado, Jonah Lobe. It's almost like you were also looking directly at your LinkedIn page, because you pretty much got covered like every single note that I had taken except for like a couple. But it's like, oh no, he already knows what we're going to talk about, which makes sense since you're you.
Yeah, but yeah, they're all different. They're all different eras of my life, and I tend to measure my creative life through these projects that I do. So it becomes easy to boil it down like a LinkedIn page, because I'm like, then I worked on this, then I worked on this, then I worked on this. But yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that because I mean, obviously, I think the big question, like the first big question that a lot of people would have in their minds if they were to like sit down and talk to you, especially related to like Bethesda and the Fallout community specifically,
Mhm.
is, do you know when Skyrim 6 is dropping? When's Fallout 5 dropping?
Nope, I do not.
Yeah, exactly.
Even
Because
if I
you,
did, I couldn't tell you. But I actually know very little. There was periods where I knew more of what was going on at Bethesda, but I've been gone for a while, so
yeah, because your
yeah,
last game, the last involvement you had was Fallout 4.
precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. What I know that what was it? Because Nate Perkapile, his last game was Fallout 76, but he wasn't, if I remember correctly, he wasn't through like fully, like he wasn't a part of the company all the way until the game's launch, if I remember correctly. Was it a similar situation with you? Like Fallout 4 was your last game as part of like being included in it, but were you still working on the project like all the way up until release, or did you kind of not drop off, but like exit the project and exit the company in at like the halfway point, the middle point? How did all that play out? When did you leave Bethesda?
I left Bethesda in late 2012, I think, or like second half of 2012 or something. I knew I was going to leave for a while because I was going to move up to New York to be with my girlfriend who'd been up here for law school, and I wanted to write that fantasy novel. And there was a clause in Bethesda's legal mumbo jumbo that you sign up for that says, anything that essentially it says anything you work on, could be debatably like hours, while
Oh
you're
yeah, like you
here.
can't have
So
like side projects and stuff.
exactly. And of course, nobody would ever go after my project, but it was one of those legal things where I was like, that's not worth it, because I want to release this thing that I want it to be my thing, and if it does well, I don't want anyone else coming for it. So it was a combination of factors. But anyway, I was one of the very first people to work on Fallout 4, because while everyone else after Skyrim, everyone moved on to like the DLCs and things like that
Mhm.
for Skyrim, I was moved ahead as kind of like a character artist to start creating some monsters and start creating some faces and things like that, so that we could kind of I could work with the art director and kind of help establish that kind of baseline look of things. And so I worked on the project for about 9 months, and I made a number of the monsters, like the Mirelurks, the Mirelurk Kings, the Bloodbugs, the Mole Rats, the Super Mutants and their outfits. Bu- 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 I'm forgetting one. But then other things like Preston Garvey's outfit and things like that, where I was also working on those, just to again create kind of a cross section of character art that could then help the rest of the team going forward. But then I left. Yeah.
You said it's interesting that you brought up working on Preston Garvey's outfit specifically because as like I'm 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 barely good at video games, let alone the industry side. But as far as I understand, um sort of like asset design when it comes to outfits is sort of a very different sort of headspace compared to asset design as far as it goes to like creatures and stuff. Um with the design, well, like you said that you designed Preston Garvey's outfit, was that in like an actual like asset creation, or were you just talking about like the physical, like, pen to paper asset design?
Yes.
And was
Yes.
that
I meant to be more specific. I didn't design his outfit, but I made his outfit for the in game. So what you see in game is my creation. I did not make that. That was originally concepted by one of our two. Which artist was it? It was Adam Adamowitz. He concepted that, and so I was following his art direction. And then the same thing goes for like a lot of the other creatures. Like he concepted the super mutants and um, the mole rats. No, that was Ray. I can't remember. Anyway, he did a lot of conceptual work, and I was generally the I basically brought it into the game. So what you see in game is what I created. Yeah.
what is the sort of like the bridge between those 2 points? Because I think with a lot of Fallout art, like concept art and stuff that we see, it's often very different and can have like a very different like tone and vibe compared to the actual finished asset. What is that bridge that connects the artistic representation to the actual like practical physical realization of those designs in game?
Yeah. Good question. For me, the bridge looked something like this. I would get a piece of concept art. And in the case of some of the concept art, it was very sketchy, very loose. This guy, individual Adam Adamowitz, who was our concept artist most of the time, who died during Fallout 4's creation,
Mhm.
he worked very fast, very loose, very sketchy. And so there's a lot of room for improvisation in there. And I also believe that, I'm not my job is not to transcribe a 2D picture into a 3D work of art. My job is to interpret that 2D art and make it into 3D art. And so I myself always demanded a lot of freedom when going from 2D to 3D. And I was always given it generally, unless things were very important. And then in terms of things that were labeled important to the design. So what I would do is I would get the assignment from the art director, and then I'd ask the art director to look at the concept art with me, and I'd ask them, what about this concept art are your favorite things? And the art director would then articulate to me what aspects they really, really liked about this design. And I knew that those were the ones I had to treat as holy. And then I would talk to the concept artist and I'd say, hey, so can you tell me what you were thinking of and what references, like real life references, you were looking at when you designed this? And what that did was that was going to be able to give me a deeper idea of where their mind was going when they created the concept. And so I could have more than just surface level details from them. And then I would create my own thing. And I would check in frequently with the art director to make sure that I wasn't completely deviating from the course. And sometimes I was told to pull back and stay more closer to the concept. but generally I was pretty trusted to make up a lot of things. And so yeah, I would take the 2D art and I'd bring it into a 3D program and I'd start sculpting it and create this high level sculpt with all these details and pores and wrinkles and things like that. And then I would create a low poly sculpt, a low poly mesh for the in-game model, which had a lot lower, a lot fewer polys, a lot less resolution. And then I would create the normal maps for that and create all the textures for that, the visual textures. And then in some cases, I would help add effects and things like that. And then I'd prepare the model for the animator, and then I'd pass it on to the animator. And then if it was a good animator, I would talk to them about what I was thinking when I made this model, and we would sometimes work together. I would in cases like that, I'd be working on a purely observational level. I wouldn't actually be working directly with them on the animations, but I would be, if it was a friend of mine, and almost all the animators were friends of mine, it was then just became a very collaborative process where they would show me what they were working on, and I'd give my feedback. And um, at a juncture like that, it's more about collaboration and less about approval. I'm not in a position to approve. The art director was always the one who had to approve. But at that point, it would just be fun, working with your buddies to make your thing come to life.
I remember at one point, I can't remember if it was on like Twitter or Instagram, but I remember seeing a snippet um from you where you were talking about specifically the facial expressions of the super mutants. And if this was like a while ago, you I if I remember correctly, you were talking about how you had an idea for how their faces could be more, I think, like directly like human, specifically in their expression. Um, can you talk a little bit about that? I'm giving a very vague reminiscent statement of the clip in question, but I just found it so interesting, the angle that you were coming out when you were talking about how uh th- like just the emotions that super mutants could have on their face, which unfortunately didn't pass over to the finished product. But I found it so interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I like monsters. Um, it's the monsters have carried through the great majority of my career and the creation of monsters. And so I like seeing, if not the humanity, at least the relatedness, the realness of monstrous things. And so, super mutants are a joke. Super mutants are funny. Super mutants are scary. Uh, but they're not. They're rarely treated as people. Uh, but they are people. And so I kind of just felt like I was really tired of more Brotherhood of Steel quests and more the same old factions. The Brotherhood of Steel. Sorry to say, it's a great idea. It's not they're not inherently all that interesting once you get past the surface level, and we see a lot of them a lot. And so, but I feel like after hundreds of years of post-apocalyptic wasteland living, the super mutants must have developed kind of their own culture, and there must be something going on there. And so I really wanted to create an asset that designers would look at and be inspired by and want to write quests all about the super mutants, where you interact with a whole bunch of super mutants and you really get to know them, as opposed to them treating them like cannon fodder. Um, and that's why I tried to create a more human-looking, relatable-looking super mutant. Ultimately, I was shut down. They wanted something more brutish, but I still like the model. It looks cool, and he still looks like an individual, kind of. He still looks like a mean mofo, but um, for the same reason why I made the Skyrim giants kind looking, or at least not hostile looking, is because I want people to have some wonder and have some interest and want to know more, about this world.
It's because like it's with the super mutant specifically. Well, I like the way you describe the giants looking kind, because if I remembering correctly, and this is over over a decade ago at this point that Skyrim came out, but I remember having a very similar reaction. I think the first time I saw a giant, like I think if it didn't, pop up with like that red enemy enemy text, the giants do look very just kind of like wise and almost nomadic in a sense when you're just like looking at them from afar. And I think it is a big part of that, just sort of like, you know, quiet, gentle looking facial features that they have.
Totally.
When it comes to the super mutant specifically, I think it's really interesting that you went at it from that angle with their facial features. Because I feel like in Fallout 1 or Fallout 1 specifically, um, there was sort of that. There was a bit more of like culture to the super mutants in a sense. Obviously, it was, you know, in relation to the master. Um, but they sort of had that. They still sort of had that you know, not individualism, but well, I mean, some of them had individualism, but more so they had like an actual faction presence to them. It felt more like a group rather than just like a bunch of, as you said, just monsters that kind of, you know, act as cannon fodder. Um, and I think specifically in like the community, a lot of people have also uh have that same mindset because there's a lot of like modders and stuff that sort of explore that, like what can a super mutant like be, you know?
Hmm.
um and I feel like Bethesda is kind of starting to experiment with that because we had obviously we had, you know, Strong in Fallout 4. We had that one dog salesman in Point Lookout, not Point Lookout, in Far Harbor that I can never remember the name of. And then in Fallout 76 specifically, we've had a number of more so like friendly super mutants. I We had a companion. I can't remember his name, but he's kind of funny because he's basically just like, "Hey, I just want to play D&D all day, because that's how I like, you know, flex on humans because I'm so superior." Which
I relate to that. That's cool. I like that.
right. With with in with Fallout 76 specifically, and how they sort of handle some super mutants. Obviously, not many because it's still, you know, an enemy faction and it's an MMO, so they just gotta throw more guys at you to kill. Um, with that game specifically, that sort of focus on maybe not super mutants as like a culture, but as like individuals. Uh, how does that feel, especially after um you know, you tried to get a little bit more personality into them as sort of like a quote unquote species, to see that now sort of kind of become a little bit more something.
Which, oh, wait,
Hmm?
did I lose you right at the end there?
No, yeah, it was just a weird way to end that sentence there, but yeah, how they sort of became like something as opposed to just being like enemies before.
What are my thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's a huge untapped resource of storytelling. I think new stories are always good, and the fact that there are all these new installments, especially within the modding community, of trying to make that more of a thing. It just shows you that there's a real hunger for that, and for those kinds of stories.
What was your I guess this is sort of a two-sided question that's basically the same question. What was your favorite Fallout game to work on, and what is your favorite Fallout game to play?
Um, it's funny. I haven't played Fallout in so many years.
Fair enough.
Uh, I really enjoyed Fallout 4 because it was the first game in a long time that Bethesda made that I didn't work on all the way through. So it still was packed with surprises for me. And I thought it was a really good game. I had issues with it, but overall, I just thought it was a really good game. I think the visuals look good, and the world building is great, and it's quite a good Bethesda game in my opinion. Um, some of the best work I ever did at Bethesda was on Fallout 4 because I was a veteran at that point. I was 7 years into the industry, into my job as a character artist, and I just created some of the best art I've ever made. Like the Death Claws from Fallout 4 is the best monster I've ever made, in my opinion. But I was working on it, as I said, kind of alone with the art director because I was moved on early. And so as an experience, it wasn't the best because I didn't get to work much with the team. And so Fallout 3 was definitely a much bigger deal to me because that was my first AAA title, first game I ever worked on from very start to very finish. Um, and ended up being really awesome and a really, solid game on its own, and really is the game that is responsible for bringing Fallout back into um, the spotlight again. So I love that one. Yeah, I loved Fallout 3.
When you when you were originally like when you originally got on with Bethesda, was it like a case of like, like this is a job, or were you one of those people who's like always wanted to work for like Bethesda specifically? Obviously, you talked about working on Fallout 3. You worked on the Shivering Isles DLC some for their character
Mhm.
creation. And I mean, like, Fallout 3 was my first Fallout game and my first Bethesda game. But you had been working on games like that for a lot longer, with, character and asset design. But when it came to when you originally came in, what was like the onus? Were you like a big Elder Scrolls fan? Was it like a specific like creative opportunity, or was it just like where you landed when you got more involved in the video game industry specifically?
Yeah, it was definitely a big deal to me. A really big deal. I was looking for a job anywhere. I would have been happy to go anywhere, but that one was a real big deal to me. And you have to remember that this was in 2005 when the very end of that year is when I got the job. And so it's a long time ago. Bethesda wasn't known the way it is now. They'd released Morrowind, and that's what I'd played Morrowind in college a couple years before and thought, holy crap, this is a weird, cool kind of game I've never seen before. I want to make games like that. And when I realized they were in Maryland, which is where I'm from, I was like, oh my gosh, I might actually have a choice, a chance. And so I applied for them for a summer internship that they were not offering, and I did not hear back. And then I went to do my senior year of college, and afterwards I applied to them again in a bunch of other places, and I did not hear back. And so then I spent 6 months grinding out on a new portfolio, upgraded portfolio, and then I applied for a third time. And this time I got an art test, and basically I'd been going there. I was desperate to work on the Elder Scrolls, and I've been seeing pictures in magazines and online of Oblivion, which had not come out yet, but there was lots of screenshots and they were doing their big media push, and it was like going to be a big effing deal. And while I thought it didn't look nearly as interesting as Morrowind did, the graphics were amazing for the time. And knowing there was an Elder Scrolls game got me incredibly excited. And so I really wanted to work on that. And when I got there, they were finishing Oblivion, and we began Shivering Isles. And Shivering Isles was the best possible, the most fun expansion for me because it was such a creative. It was like, let's make Oblivion, but like weirder, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to get weirder. So I was amped to jump in there with the Elder Scrolls. But when we moved to Fallout 3, but what surprised me though is when my art test for Bethesda, it was a picture of a raider. And I was like, wait, what? This is not Elder Scrolls. Like, what is this? But I just looked at it and I just thought, I don't know why, but I just feel like this is Fallout. And then they confirmed that it was Fallout, and that they just recently acquired the Fallout IP. So that was a big deal. And so even though then after the Shivering Isles, I moved off Elder Scrolls, it was an incredible opportunity to jump onto this game that I had only played at like sleepovers at my friends' houses uh, years before. And it was like a legendary game suddenly plopped in our lap. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like like I actually have played this game. Like I know this game. And the next kind of 2.5 years working on that game was like a really pivotal point in my career where I learned a lot of the basics and the fundamentals of good character art. And I really made a lot of monsters for that game. And but this was at a time when I was still a new hire, and so it was a big deal to me that I was getting to do this because this was a rare opportunity. So I was what I didn't come for Elder Scrolls, but when that landed in my lap, there was no complaints from me. I was like, this sounds awesome. I'm in.
One of those happy accident kind of things.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think my whole job at Bethesda was a happy accident because they were not the company they are today.
I know I've actually interviewed another person who's currently working for Bethesda and worked on Starfield a little bit. I gotta ask him that like is this a happy accident? Does this feel like a getting hired by Bethesda? He started out modding Fallout 4, so it's probably is, but probably a little bit to a different degree than you specifically. But it's it's it is and it is not interesting that you came in as a an Elder Scrolls fan, because I feel like a lot of early Bethesda fans, like that was like their in to Bethesda. It was
Yeah.
the Elder Scrolls series. If for either like Fallout 5 or Elder Scrolls 6, if Bethesda were to, like, like let's say like Todd Howard calls you up uh and on in like the middle of the night, like 2 in the morning, on one of his crazy video game benders down at the chess club. If he was to like offer you to like come back to do asset creation for those games, would that be something that, in like a hypothetical, is like, would that be something you'd be interested in, or would you continue on your own work? Because Tim Kaine a while ago did a video where he was talking about his time at uh Black Isle, and when he was offered the job to do, or offered to do a follow up or a sequel to Fallout 2. He talked about how he wasn't really interested in it because he didn't feel like, not so much that there wasn't anything interesting to say, but like there wasn't sort of that like challenge, that hook that really dug in and was like, this is the reason you need to do the second one, because it's, an artistic challenge, it's an intellectual challenge. Would Do you see that as being something that, in a hypothetical, that would prevent you from being involved in like Fallout 5 or Elder Scrolls 6? Or is it more so just like you're more focused on doing other things, like your comic book and your art classes?
Um, yeah, it's obviously a question that I've thought about in various hypotheticals over the years, and sometimes I even have dreams where I am back at Bethesda. um, but I'll tell you, they're not really good dreams, and that's not because Bethesda wasn't fantastic to be in. It was. I had a great time. I really, really did. It was such a beautiful 7 years of my life. But I'm from Maryland. It's in Maryland. I need change, and I kind of realized while I was there that I wasn't growing in these very critical ways because I was doing the same thing 9 to 5 that I'd been doing for 7 years. And even though I was better at it, and we were working on better selling games, it was still the same thing. And so since then, I've written books. I've illustrated books. I'm now debuting my own intellectual property. I've I illustrated, Marvel's one and only anatomy book. Like I've done all kinds of things and had all kinds of opportunities that I wouldn't have if I just stayed there. And I think the brass at Bethesda is very intent on maintaining the structures and hierarchy that they've got going on now. It's like they just the same two art directors go back and forth, taking turns being art director and like blah blah blah. And also, the company is just very corporate. It's very powerful. It's very amazing. It's very corporate, and there's hundreds and hundreds of more people who work there than did when I was there. So, unless I was really offered something that involved both art and design, as in like designing what happens in the game and all these things and coming up with the ideas, I just don't think that I'm interested because I think that creating assets in 3D for a video game was so fun for 7 years. And after that, I kind of just lost. I've honestly lost interest in the medium, not the medium of games altogether, but the medium of character art creation. And but games in general are not don't as appeal. The game making, not games themselves. Game making doesn't appeal to me as much as it used to. I think I've had a couple negative experiences since then. Like the two games that I worked on, the big one for a AAA company, and then the little one that was just me and two friends. Both of them kind of crashing reminded me how hard this world is and how much I don't know. Yeah. So no, the answer is no. I would not accept a job at Bethesda Softworks again unless they gave me a lot of money and gave me a lot of creative freedom. Um, but I really look for. With that said, I really look forward to playing the next Elder Scrolls game.
Um, is let's see, how do I phrase what's in my head? Um, you've talked about um you specifically said like you're not interested in working on video games anymore, which definitely makes a whole lot of sense. You definitely seem to be more of the creative side. I
Mhm.
feel like there's a very specific relationship in creating an asset as opposed to designing an asset. um would there like you say you don't want to work on a video game or in the video game industry specifically when it comes to, especially nowadays, because I feel like there's a lot more franchises that are more, video game franchises specifically, and movie franchises as well. There's a lot of franchises that are making illustrated, comic books, digital books, graphic novels, stuff like that, that are basically like not sequels, but sort of like additional content to video games. One of the ones that stands out to me specifically is the one they did for Cult of the Lamb. They did both a couple of short videos, but then they also had like an actual like sort of like choose your own adventure um digital like comic book basically that was like a part, it's like in the game now, and I'm pretty sure they have like physical copies as well. um is is that something that uh is like more interesting compared to asset creation, or is it just mostly like, because like you talked about before, you worked on a couple of projects for both an independent thing and a AAA thing, and they ended up not going uh exactly well.
Mhm.
But is it that sort of combination where you are not interested in working on games, but you would potentially, obviously in the right circumstances, work on what is it, like worlds related to those games, but in more so of an actual like illustrated art specific format, like comics and graphic novels.
Yeah. I would say almost altogether, no. I have no interest in that, and I think a lot of it stems from basically there's too many franchises and they have too much money and they mean less and less. I think, with a few exceptions, as these franchises get bigger and bigger, they feel more and more like money grabs to me. And so making Skyrim the illustrated book does not really appeal to me, because it's just that's the kind of thing I did with Marvel, because it was basically like a real collector's edition, a special book, an interesting book, one that inspires your thoughts, a world in which I can make up lots of different things because I am the illustrator and I get to dictate what's inside Iron Man's carapace or
Mhm.
whatever. But no, I what it comes down to is I don't want to work for a company on a pre-existing IP, because that doesn't they don't leave a lot of space for my independent thought to come through. And then when I am, when I do add things to that world, the best thing I can hope for is that it get my whatever I create gets subsumed into that world, which is great. But as an independent creator, I just want to create my own worlds. Basically, I regret nothing of my time at Bethesda working on these amazing games, and I got to create things that will live on forever. It's very special and it's very precious. Um, but the my contributions to those games end up, helping shareholders a lot more than they helped me,
Mhm.
financially at the time. And they ultimately they don't belong to me. Like, this is the great, they made like a 2 foot tall death claw sculpture that's like $1,500. Gaming Heads did, and it's exactly my art. Someone didn't make my art. Someone they just literally just took my art, posed it, and then hit print, and then they gave it a quick spray job, and then sold it.
Mhm.
Nobody gave me one piece of plastic. Nobody gave nobody's giving me anything from this. There's no gratitude, because it all belongs basically to the company, and listen, and that's what I signed up for, and I'm grateful to have done that. But it's easy to feel after a while neglected or unappreciated, and I think a lot of people at Bethesda and then a lot of companies feel neglected and cast off because ultimately you can love Star Wars your whole life and you get a job making Star Wars stuff, and then they could just fire you because the game you're working on for Star Wars didn't earn enough money, and you're just gone now. And at that point you're like, well, but I put my love into that, and now the people who are actually making the money off these franchises just kicked me out. So again, I wasn't kicked out of Bethesda. I left on really good terms, and I really have such good feelings for everybody there for while I was there. But I was a young man, you know what I mean? I had a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm that I can put into these titles. And then I was creating new ground. I was creating new assets that were helping to create canon for these things in a very foundational way. And so that was a very lucky place to be. But I think when we get to a point where these franchises just kind of like giant elephants just trudge on into the future, collecting shows and memorabilia and sequels and sequels and sequels. After a while, it just becomes like, oh, it's not a thing I love as much because it's kind of been co-opted by the corporate mega structure. Um, so this is why I say, like, illustrating a book for Skyrim or for the Elder Scrolls, it really doesn't appeal to me because it's like that's the first of all, the games themselves are way bigger than any book would be. And secondly, they only exist in an atmosphere or an ecosystem where people are familiar with the game itself. And then you're kind of just working on these ever smaller audiences of people who are looking for a particular fix. They want the Star Wars fix. They want the Fallout fix. They want whatever. And if you're creating something that doesn't quite blend with that because you're trying to create something original, sometimes it works out, but oftentimes, people are not okay with that because they want more of the same. Give me more of the same. And so I'm very happy working on my comic book, even if it never gets made into a movie, even if it never gets made into a game, I will have created something that was uniquely my own and didn't belong to any kind of major company, where, who can take all my money and take all my rights, and it belongs to me. And it's special because it's mine. Um, so that's a very long answer to your question. Am I interested in
I mean,
making
it's a big question, and I feel like you touched on a lot of the important aspects of creation, and more so like these days, sort of like monetized creation, where you're either creating something or are working on something for financial gain. Um, but the wall there that you described, where artistic creativity and freedom run into corporatization in a sense. I feel like that's a big thing. I can't remember um I can't remember the exact quote, but I remember one of the most like kind of like the realist quote that I remember hearing at one point is that humans need to use their hands to feel creative, right? They need to sort of have that relationship between like themselves and the thing that they're working on. That's why we see like less and less, personally designed just anything. There used to be a point where like all the furniture was handmade, all the bowls and decorative pieces and things like that. They were all handmade, but now it's just more so like things are sort of like copy and pasted, and printed and just repeated. And that sort of like I guess modernization, but I feel like, yeah, I feel like video games are definitely at that point as well, to where there are still a lot of games made, especially in like the indie scene, uh but especially in the AAA scene, where a lot more developers can work on projects and make them a lot more, vibrant, expressive, engaging, this, that, and the other thing. But at the end of the day, a lot of the benefit come or goes specifically to those smaller number of people that reap the benefit. I think that especially in 2024, where we saw massive layoffs of a lot of people in the game industry, like, the community as a whole is kind of starting to get on board with that, where they want to see a lot more unique and individual things from, developers, artists, creatives, designers, all that stuff. You've talked a
Mhm.
lot about well, you mentioned a couple times your the comic book that you're working on, Quiet Level 1. um and with any good art project, there's a lot of stuff that you kind of, keep close to the chest, because you want to save it for the big release, the big reveal. But you have talked about some stuff related to the project. Can you go in a little bit more about Quiet and his mute skeleton adventures?
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to. Um, so basically, it's funny we were coming off the talk about video games because I love video games, and in many ways, it is kind of an homage to video games in many ways, as well as kind of Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy, the fantasy genre as a whole. So Quiet Level One, for anyone who doesn't know, I just launched on a Kickstarter this summer. Did really well. It got 1,000% funded,
Ooh.
which is so fun. And it's the story of a mute little skeleton who's a level one skeleton who is forced to go up against and stop the journey of level 100 barbarian. I don't ever really explicitly say in there that he is level 100 or whatever, but it's implied.
Mhm.
And Quiet themselves they're basically completely outmatched. They have the body of a toddler, they're a skeleton, and they have to go on this impossible quest. And it's basically a quest of it's meant to feel um, very familiar and yet be completely original. So it's got a lot of video gamey kinds of things. There's like a not like a loading screen, but there's like a store where like basically you go in there and you're basically unkillable. You can get +1 potions. You can get these little kind of Zelda like powers, powerful items, that kind of thing. And there's of course dungeon crawling and monsters and lots of adventure. And so that's what I've been working on, and it's going really well. And as I said, the Kickstarter went really well, and the book is going really well. And I'm just focusing all I have on it right now because um, I'm really enthusiastic about it. We were just talking about, my love is the creation of original worlds, and this is that. And so this is my chance to really dig in and do kind of what every artist really wants to do, which is work on their world and um, and have an audience that are looking forward to getting it. So that big following on Kickstarter, I've got over 2,100 people who are getting the book, and this is kind of just the very beginning of this whole journey, but it's off to a really good start, and I'm really giving this book my all.
Are you a big it's specifically when it comes to in because you're working on comics, you seem to have a very a strong passion for the illustrated story. You talked about working on Marvel's Anatomy, which is a really like, because you always like look back at sort of like those older diagrams with like dissected frogs and stuff
Oh
like
yeah.
that, and like, man, that's crazy. But what you did with that is you applied it to superheroes, and because superheroes have such, one unique character design, especially with like Nightcrawler and a lot of other humanoid mutants. It's very interesting to like look at. But then you also cover more like direct human looking superheroes like Thor. But because he is Asgardian and as such has more so enhanced natural physiques, you go a lot more into that, which I think is very interesting. But when it comes to the work that you're doing specifically with your comic book, are you taking any inspiration from like Japanese manga with what not with how you're crafting the story, but sort of like with the stories you're telling? Because as you were talking about the story, there were two specifics that popped into my mind. I'm not even at all going to try to pronounce the original names, the non-English names of these two stories, because I absolutely know I'm going to butcher it. But the first one is called Go Go Loser Ranger, and what it is effectively is you remember like Power Rangers and stuff, and Power Rangers
Oh yeah.
always running around fighting the bad guys and stuff. This story effectively is that, but from the point of view of one of those the random generic
I've
guys in
heard of that.
suits. Yeah,
I've heard of that.
it's really interesting because it's another one of those stories that sort of takes the idea and the atypicalness of sort of like the hero story and flips it on his head, where as in this story, the quote unquote good guys, the Power Ranger stand-in, are actually like bad people, and they're like egotistical and like in it for money and stuff like that. And they're sort of bullying these like low level grunts that you know are still like like, oh, we're like the foot soldiers of the bad guy and stuff, but they still have like personality and character. And that's kind of what I was thinking when you were talking about how you know Quiet's like a level 1 skeleton, and he's got to stop this level 100 barbarian. It kind of made me think like, oh, like the barbarian is supposed to be like the player character who's like really strong and like grinds all the time, and now he's can just like knock out enemies left, right, and center. But then
Yes.
it also made me think of
You get it. That you get it right away.
yeah. It makes sense. But then there's also this Korean anime. I don't know if they call it something different. Or sorry, manga. Which I mean they must call it something different. It's called The Gamer, and it also leans a lot into, well, it leans like really heavily into what you were talking about with Quiet Level 1, the sort of video game world that they live in with like levels and potions and item shops and stuff like that. To put it basically, the gamer is it's in a world where like magic and like superpowers are like real and stuff, but they are very very specific. So the main character has the power of like the gamer, so he basically sees like health bars, mana pools, status effects, stuff like that. And
That's funny.
I think you would actually find it really interesting with both your background uh in gaming and game design, but also in what you're trying to do with Quiet Level 1, because specifically like bringing a lot of aspects of video games into a storytelling medium is really interesting, because you kind of have to figure out like how those aspects are going to work in not only a realistic and believable sense, but more so a realistic and believable sense as it relates to the story you're trying to tell.
Mm,
Which both of those things I think is really interesting, because the video game aspect kind of helps us understand and break down the world in a way that I think a lot of people today, because video games are a lot more of a ubiquitous thing that people take part in, it helps them to understand the world better, because they're coming at it with tools and resources that they sort of already have. Like, oh, health potion, I understand that. Or level standards, I get that. Status effects, this, that, and the other thing. But then specifically with the style of story that you're telling, I think is really interesting. So was there any like inspiration from Eastern storytelling, manga, Korean comic books, any other sources of inspiration that you pulled from, or maybe naturally developed, that helped you to create Quiet Level 1?
Yeah, good question. I can't say that there is really. Not directly, at least. I mean, manga of most forms comes in black and white, and I think that was so. In that regard, when I go to the Barnes and Noble and all that, I definitely take some while to flip through them because I'm like, these are people who know, like, these are comic artists who've been working in black and white for so long. This is their medium. I'm doing it in part because I wanted to limit the number of things I had to do for this. I didn't want to have to color the whole thing,
Yeah.
but I also wanted to create a nostalgic feel, and I wanted to create a very particular aesthetic that I thought would separate my comic from other comics. Most comics you see that are in black and white, these days are manga, and so I think there's amazing artistry and amazing tips and techniques that I can be getting from there. So I've definitely, for instance, I'm a big fan of the Akira comics, and I've been kind of collecting those, and I just will ogle a single frame for so long, just to study and figure out how they do movement and how they do details and how they get you to slow down or speed up and all that kind of thing. But with that said, I don't consume enough. In fact, I consume hardly any manga, such that I can't say honestly that it's been a huge wellspring of um, what's the word I'm looking for?
Inspiration,
Thank you. Yes,
yeah.
inspiration precisely.
Yeah. I mostly just asked that because it was, it was design aspects of like, like levels, potions, things like
Yeah,
that.
no, yeah, no, I get it, and that makes a lot of sense, and I think I need to check that out for sure.
I,
I
I
didn't want, I didn't want Quiet Level One to be so on the nose, because I think that then it becomes its entire identity,
mhm.
and it becomes hard then to build real stakes and to build real emotion in a world that feels like it's one big joke. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done. I just don't know how to do it, and I know it's done all the time. But with Quiet, I definitely want you, the reader, to be reading it and be like, "Oh, that's so funny that he like got this very basic item that is like very ubiquitous in so many video games," or like they refer to the different levels of the world tree, which is where it all takes place, as level one of the labyrinth, level two of the plains, all these different things, and so I wanted to feel familiar and to be constantly giving little Easter eggs. Um, and to that end, I think I should definitely read this comic book you've been talking about because that obviously demonstrates a mind of somebody who's been thinking very very deeply about comic books and trying to figure out what kind of stories you can tell with them. And because I've been doing the same thing, I've been trying to figure out like, okay, if this is based on comics, what are the tropes? I need bosses, and I need locked doors, and I need treasures to find, and I need swords of +1 accuracy and things like that, but without also saying at any point like this is a video game, like this, that kind of thing, because I also want to play with the idea of D&D as well, and the fantasy genre as a whole. A lot of it's a world that's so full of tropes and stereotypes that I think that I'm giving my own go to try to make it kind of bring a unique uh, flavor to something that's been really well trod.
I think that the gamer specifically you would find really, really interesting because it goes like it's funny because it kind of obviously it reads like a story, a typical you know for the gamer specifically, I don't like saying typical manga story because it's not um it's Korean uh origins as opposed to manga, which is Japanese origin. So it's like not exactly the same thing. It would be like saying, like, oh, this American story is the exact same thing as like, this Argentinian story, just because we're from the same general area of the planet. But as far as its actual story goes, it's really interesting because it kind of a little bit feels like it was uh written by either a previous game dev themselves or somebody who was just like a massive video game fan, like RPG fan, because there's stats and there's mini bosses, boss battles, and spells. It feels very much like they were inspired by like D&D, World of Warcraft, maybe like older RPG games. And it's really interesting just how deep it goes into some of the statistics. Like there's a couple of they kind of get into like, a bunch of different video game styles like castle defense games. Some games that are kind of like Eve Online, where you sort of like can like set up passive grinds and just like mine resources and stuff like that. It's really interesting. I think it would probably be for just like the general understanding of the story that you're trying to tell. I think it would be a little bit too in depth in the video. A little, like you said, a little bit too on the nose. But it's still really interesting to see how somebody who may or may not have that sort of experience in the game industry like you do um, approaches telling a story in that manner. Um, I think it's really interesting, though. You talked about though how a lot of your inspiration came from like D&D. It seems you have a stronger affiliation towards um, like fantasy style games and stories and
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
What were some of the like stronger inspirations for Quiet Level One?
I think that's a good question. I think Skyrim's definitely in there.
Obviously.
um, yeah, with the the swords and sorcery and the kind of level of technology and the kind of Skyrim is a very, in some ways it's a very typical fantasy world. It's kind of just like Viking world kind of. Um, but other things like Conan is a huge inspiration. Those big epic romps through of sorcerers and mazes and items of power, that kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of like the Odyssey, like like the root.
Yes, exactly, exactly. It is a root. It's a yeah, exactly. And then I would say other things like Lord of the Rings for sure. Zelda for sure.
Mhm.
The old comic book Bone. If any of your listeners have ever read that, is a big inspiration. Diablo as another you know thing, because a lot of the premise of it, as you mentioned, is the archetype flipped on its head. Is the human protagonist going around stomping all these enemies. What if that protagonist is actually the antagonist, and our protagonist is a little level one skeleton, who was never supposed to survive your plunge through the very first dungeon,
Mhm.
um, and so taking something like that, like the Blizzard idea, and then and putting it on its head. So yeah, a lot of those were inspirations for me, and yeah. So classic swords and sorcery.
That makes sense. As far as like the narrative specifically, because I feel like there are certain stories where the narrative can be very different from the setting that it's in. You can have a story set in like the scariest, spookiest place like you could possibly imagine, and yet the actual story is a lot different. It's very juxtaposed to its surroundings. With the story though, what is the story that you're trying to tell? What are some of the themes that you want to touch on with the story? Because I think you what what was the name of the tree you mentioned again?
The Tree of Worlds.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like there's different levels
Yeah.
to that. So it's like, we can definitely expect quiet level 2 and level 3 and stuff like that. But like where are you hoping to take the story, and what sort of, themes and narratives are you looking or interested to explore?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we live in an age where, especially in fantasy, where it's kind of expected that you level up and you get all the superpowers and you learn cool abilities and you can flip and you can jump and all these different things. And I think having a protagonist like a hobbit, basically, who is a small character who's not a very good fighter, who has things they're good at, but they're kind of unlikely heroes. I think we haven't seen that in a long time, from anywhere really. I think we need sex appeal, we need tall, dashing figures, all these things, and going, the idea of if the Hobbit weren't a thing already that had built so much other fantasy, they would never make a movie or a series of movies about small, pudgy, curly-haired men with hairy feet. You know, like that would not be the protagonist. Aragorn would be the protagonist from the beginning to the end. And even Aragorn, I was rewatching the Return of the King recently. Aragorn is a perfect prime example of what like fantastic, amazing, like pinnacle of masculinity should be,
Mhm.
in that he is kind, gentle, thoughtful, you know, all these different things, and this is what makes him worthy of being a king. And I think these, especially with the current political climate and all that, I think an emphasis on kindness and on gentleness and on thought is so important. And I'm kind of exploring that theme not just through Quiet themselves' journey, because Quiet cannot speak. Their best friend is a caterpillar who's called the narrator worm, who narrates their journey, but who's also a character in, you know, who is alongside Quiet on their journey and is just as much in danger at any given moment as Quiet is. So we have one character who doesn't talk very much and one character who talks all the time. But that's an interesting kind of venue in which to kind of show a journey, where, you know, because I kind of realized, you know, I'm not even that interested in the protagonist of my story, because they're going to say the same thing that every protagonist of every story has ever said. Oh, why me? I'm so small. You know. Oh, no, you were chosen. Blah blah. You know, all that stuff. It can go out the window because it's been done before. And so I'm looking forward to exploring these themes through this new kind of character, a character who's small, pretty weak, who literally is voiceless. But I also want to explore that through the realm of the villain, Galahorn, who is kind of the Conan of this world, because I think he's a human, or at least he's something similar to a human, and um, he has his own spiritual journey to make, and so taking what we initially think as a very two-dimensional fantasy world and really drilling down on the learned lessons that I want to get across. You know, that like gentleness and kindness is important, and caring is important, and doing the right thing. You know, can, you know, I like that idea of basically really trying to get across this moral, but by using these tropes in a non-tropey way. I'm not explaining this very well, but I'm a big fan of depth. I'm a big fan of characters. Obviously, I love characters, and I want to see where the villain goes just as much as I want to see where Quiet goes, because there are ways in which they are profoundly different, and yet there are ways that they are very similar. And that's the kind of thing that's only illuminated as the story goes on. And I also think that in fantasy and in superhero storytelling as well, we have a persistent myth that individuals will rise up just at the right moment and save everyone. And I think this idea is really sweet and really nice and way overplayed and totally unrelatable. You know, we all want someone to come along and save us, but it's not going to happen. And because we all have to work together to save ourselves and to help each other. And so I I want to get away from that kind of faded, you know, everything will be okay, and the main character can handle it all, because I think um, it's celebrating and mythologizing something that I don't even really believe in, you know. But I believe that the main character, along with their friends, can maybe create some kind of change, and things are going to end up really bad, but also really good. But maybe both things can be true at the same time. And maybe the bad people are not as bad as we think they are. Maybe they think they're doing the right thing, and all they have to do is be persuaded otherwise. And if you can get all these really true, beautiful, kind of basic truths about people across in a story that also has fighting and monsters and death pits and labyrinths and dragons and giants and dudes with huge wolf-headed axes that just demolish everything in their path. Sounds really fun. You know, that's the kind of story I want to read. Um, so yeah, that's That's the answer.
where it's kind of like it's action packed, but it has like a moral, kind of like almost like fable or like folklore center to it, to where like there's kind of, a humanistic point to the story,
Exactly. I think that we live in a time of great fantasy, where fantasy's everywhere and it's pervasive and it's great. And fantasy is wonderful because you can tell any story that you want, but the stories don't mean anything unless they are speaking to people's real life, And I think we live in an age where a lot of people are confused and scared and existentially feeling a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of terror. And having a character who gets knocked down and still gets up again, like the Chumbawamba song, even when they're scared, even when they're plainly don't stand a chance. I think it's important for people to see that. And so I want to create a little light in the darkness.
It's funny that you talked about, well, I guess first and foremost, did you see the trailer for the James Gunn Superman movie that's coming out?
I did see the trailer, yes.
It's funny that you talked before about, like, oh, like we shouldn't be expecting like somebody to show up and save us and stuff like that. We need to kind of like, take things into our own hands, and try to be better people. Um and it's also very interesting that you talked about the sort of like telling a story that's more about like kindness and gentleness and being good and being moral, um because one of the things that a lot of people on the internet are theorizing with the story of James Gunn's Superman movie, which I think he's kind of sort of been like talking a little bit about in the background. Basically, like, a lot of people are thinking that the James Gunn Superman movie is going to be more of a departure from previous stories, where they've kind of leaned into that, like, dark and grim and gritty superhero style, uh storytelling, where it's more realistic, yes, but it's also a lot more, dour.
Totally.
With this story, it seems like it's leaning a lot more into what used to make like comic book stories specifically more enjoyable, that sort of better outlook on the world, better outlook on life. When it comes to that style of storytelling specifically, is that what you're looking to more so lean into with Quiet Level One? That, you know things aren't super great. Nobody's really going to, come to your rescue or anything like that. At least not intentionally, or maybe at all. But as long as you sort of keep that level of, morality, focus, determination, sort of the seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, or the silver lining in the rain cloud, that seems to be more the story that you're looking to tell with Quiet Level One.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. I'm a big fan of gritty superhero movies. I think they bring in they made superheroes a bit more believable and a bit more relatable. I think with something like Superman, my ultimate problem with Superman is that he can do anything and he's Superman. And so I'd be interested to see a movie where he's not. The problem is Superman is Superman, and at the end of the film, he always gets all his powers back, and he transforms into an unstoppable juggernaut and takes on everybody. And so I love the return to sweetness. I think that's worth something for real. I think for a lot of people that is what Superman is. He's kind of a little bit more G-rated. He's not so gritty, and he's just good to the core. He's a good guy. I always found that the recent editions, where he's like evil Superman, to be real tiresome. I appreciate the idea, but I just thought it was just kind of drab storytelling.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think you're right. The return to sweetness is definitely part of it. I think that the only distinction I would make is that my hero is a little toddler shaped skeleton who can't speak. who ultimately, even at his max level, is never going to be that dope.
Right. He's not
um,
going to become God like Superman did a couple of
exactly,
times.
exactly, exactly. Because Superman is ultimately a dude who's like 6'4" with like the most perfect physique ever and the most chiseled jawline ever,
Yeah.
and he
Plus,
comes and he saves everybody and he looks handsome doing it, and you know it's inevitable that he's going to be Superman, you
yeah,
know,
because
and
that's
so I
like
think that
it's a
people
narrative
don't
tool.
feel like Superman. You know, they in real life, no one feels like Superman, and I feel like we much more often feel like tiny voiceless nobodies. You
Mhm.
know, and so I think that the only distinction I would make would be just that I would like people to once again feel not so bad about being quiet, voiceless nobodies.
Yeah, because we can't all be, a narrative tool that's basically like the perfect ideal. Some of us are just that. We're
Exactly. Most of us are just that. Most of
yeah,
us are not perfect ideals.
but that doesn't mean we can't, do great things.
Exactly. Precisely. Yeah. Precisely. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Yeah, definitely. It was great having you on.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you to everybody for listening, and I'm sorry we didn't talk about Skyrim and Fallout enough. But maybe next time.
We covered a lot. And if you ever want to come back on the podcast, we would definitely love to have you on.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for everybody who listened. And for anybody who wants to check out Quiet Level One, just Google Quiet Level One. It's right on Kickstarter, and you can still join it, even though the Kickstarter is closed. You can still pick up your copy, and I highly recommend the hardcover. It's going to be dope.
Buy it. It's going to be amazing.
Woo!
Woo!
All right, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Jonah Lobe, former Bethesda creature artist and current illustrator of the graphic novel Quiet Level 1. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow to be notified of future episodes and consider subscribing to our Patreon, where your monthly contribution will go towards improving the quality of transmission, keeping episodes ad-free, as well as helping to decrease the time between uploads. Until next time, dear listener, I thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all out there in the wasteland.